Okay, some trends here to note. So is ED automatically better then? Is that like the simple answer to a question? Well, yes, but like I said earlier, we need to keep in mind that some of these schools will be using the early round to recruit special cases, right? So of course, many of these colleges will be recruiting athletes, and oftentimes athletic recruits are told to apply early by the coaches because it gives them more leverage, it gives them a chance to talk to the admissions offices. So even if we factor that in, though, we can do a comparison here using Brown University. So Brown, in any given year, will probably recruit about 200 athletes, sure, because they need to field a football team and a basketball team or whatever, right? And add to that another 100 special case recruits. These could be like VIP cases, the son or daughter of a world leader, or maybe someone who is a world-class musician, even as a teenager, right? There are always going to be special cases like that. So even if you factor that in, Brown's, let's say on a given year, about 14.5%. If you factor those in and remove them from the consideration, the effective ED rate would fall to about 10.2%. But if you're still comparing that to the RD only rate of about 3.5%, that's still close to 3 times as much, right? So it's still a pretty significant advantage, right? So there's also, of course, the fact that the boosted acceptance rate is also because of some self-selection, right? In the early round, people know it's pretty competitive. So some people who don't have a shot may not even want to apply. They may want to wait until regular decision to apply and just kind of just do their Hail Mary application to the school. Okay. But even then, bottom line, is it better to apply ED? In most cases, I would probably say yes. Okay. Based on our observations over the last few years, we've tended to note here that ED tends to work best for schools that are in what we call the reach category. And now what we mean by this is it's not a far reach or total dream school where you're really just taking a shot at it, even if you don't have numbers that are competitive, right? So a reach category would be something where your numbers are pretty competitive for the school. I would say in terms of SAT or ACT, you'd probably be close to or above the 75th percentile. Your GPA is probably really close to the average acceptance student's GPA. If you have numbers like that and you have an activity profile that is reasonably competitive, then this is where ED is going to give you the biggest boost in terms of your chances of getting in. Now, if you're applying and your numbers are nowhere near that, it could actually backfire, right? Because you're applying to a pool that's already pretty competitive. If your numbers are not pretty good, you may end up looking, your application might stick out for the wrong reasons, basically, right? So it may make you less competitive perceptually versus some other people. Now, conversely, you don't want to select an ED school that you are very competitive for to the point where it's like a 50-50 shot to get in, right? If it's like in that target range where you're very competitive for the schools, you probably don't want to use up your ED, right? For the obvious reason of you'd be selling yourself short. If you got into that ED school, then, well, who's to know if you could have gotten into better schools, right? So it makes sense for you to go ahead and maybe reserve that ED for a school that's a little bit still more competitive compared to your other schools, but it's something that you're still, reasonably in the conversation for based on your numbers, basically. Okay. So it's also generally recommended to have at least one early action or early decision school. And of course, the reasoning for this too is that it gives students an early jump on working on the applications, getting recommendation letters, finishing up your Common App personal statement, and just filling out your activities, right? It makes the process a lot less stressful, especially for seniors, if you can have sent out at least one early action or even an ED school. Obviously, the benefit of getting into the ED school in the first place is that once you get in, you're done, right? You don't even have to send out any of those safety schools. You don't have to worry about going through the holidays wondering if you're even getting into some good schools, right? So that's one of the huge psychological advantages of getting into your ED school, but you can still get to a lesser degree that same sort of satisfaction of knowing you at least, have a higher floor, so to speak, if you got into at least one or two of your schools for early action, because then you could probably even choose not to send in some EA schools or sorry, some safety schools that you were thinking of for regular decision if you got into at least one or two of your EA schools. Okay. Next is when should you apply for ED? Okay. So ED works best if you have a clear-cut number one choice, like your dream school, you always wanted to go to this school, and you really want to enhance your chances of applying to the school, right? So it makes sense for you to go ahead and give every single advantage to that one school if you know you're competitive and it's always been your dream school. Now, it's smart for you before you decide to apply to an ED school to go ahead and check first if you think you will need to apply for financial aid. It makes a lot of sense for you to check what's called a net price calculator or financial aid calculator on that school's website, because then it allows you to go ahead and have a fairly accurate estimation of how much financial aid you're expected to get from the school. Now, of course, the schools make adjustments once you get your FAFSA, which is your financial aid application. But oftentimes it'll be very, very close to the number because they don't want to necessarily mislead you thinking that you're going to get a lot more aid. Okay. So for the most part, though, ED schools that accept you, they accept you because they want you. They've decided that you're a very strong candidate for their school. So oftentimes they're going to at least match what the federal formula dictates you're going to get for financial aid. And in many cases, they even exceed it because they want to make sure that you're comfortable with the fact that you've gotten in and there's no hesitation. However, in some very rare cases, some students may be what's called gapped by the school. In other words, this is where you receive even less financial aid than what the FAFSA or the federal formula dictates you should be receiving. And in those cases, actually, these are one of the stipulated sort of loopholes that allows you to sort of back out of your ED agreement. Because if you get even less financial aid than what the federal formula dictates, then you don't have to go to the school. You don't have to honor the ED agreement at that point. But I think that's very, very rare. That's, definitely something that doesn't happen all that much. And oftentimes, if you still really want to go to the school, you can still have other avenues to talk to the financial aid office. Sometimes maybe they can modify the aid package even after the initial package that you're offered. Okay. So one of the key things that you should also note, though, is that ED does tend to give you the biggest boost relative to, let's say, early action. So oftentimes, if, let's say, for example, you don't necessarily have a clear-cut number one dream school, but your goal is just to get into one of maybe a selection of schools, it might be good to strategically go ED because ED will give you a higher percentage increase versus, let's say, an EA school or a restricted early action school like a Harvard, Stanford. So let's say, for example, you're like, well, you know what? Columbia and Yale are both pretty good options for me, but Columbia has ED, right? And if you're not necessarily sort of like partial towards one or the other, you think they're both outstanding schools that would fit your major really well, then you might lean towards going ED because it actually gives you a higher boost, okay? So conversely, when should you not apply for ED then? Well, if your top college choices are not ones that actually have early action, then maybe that should give you pause, right? You should hesitate in terms of applying for early decision. So a classic example that I give students as sort of like a litmus test to determine whether or not they should apply ED is, let's say, for example, you are very, very interested in both the top two UCs, UC Berkeley, UCLA, because they have maybe outstanding business programs or engineering programs, right? And if you're a California resident, the tuition is probably going to be half, less than half even, of what a top private university would charge, right? So in that case, if certain schools fit your criteria better, then you may decide that it's actually not beneficial for you to go ahead and apply ED to a school. Now, what you could do in those cases is you can apply to several EA schools that don't conflict. That still gives you the option of finding out and then choosing after the early rounds are over and waiting for the regular decisions to come out before you commit to a school, right? So that's definitely one possibility. Also, another key situation is that if you're applying earlier, you're considering applying early, but your junior year had your worst grades, especially I would say if you had your worst semester in the second semester of junior year, that should really make you consider whether or not even applying early would be a good idea. Because oftentimes schools will err towards deferring you, giving you another shot until regular decision because they want to see whether or not you can make a turnaround on that first semester of senior year. So if your grades were not the greatest in 11th grade, then you should be much more conservative about trying to go for early decision because chances are they will probably want to defer you anyway. Okay. So in that case, like one of the things I'd recommend is just going for some EA schools just so you have your, early safeties locked in. And that way you can have a little bit more flexibility with, choosing schools later on. Okay. Okay, so how many colleges should I apply to? Or this is oftentimes a question that I get asked. Before we decide that, it's important to know the rules and the differences between EA and ED. I hadn't quite mentioned it earlier, but the key difference between early action and early decision is that early decision is binding. If you're accepted for early decision, you are committed to go. In fact, you have to sign an ED agreement that basically says, I am, committing to go to your school if I'm accepted. Okay. EA, on the other hand, you apply early, usually sometime in November. You find out early, sometimes in December, sometimes in January, but you're not committed to go, right? You can wait until all your regular decision results are out before you decide to commit to a certain school. So one of the key, I guess, slightly different versions of EA is some schools, especially like top universities like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford, have something called restricted early action or single choice early action. This is actually a mutually exclusive option to ED. So if you're thinking of applying to, like, say, Harvard or Yale or Stanford, you cannot apply to an ED school. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of a loophole here in that you can still apply to some other EA schools, but they have to be a public institution. So theoretically, you can apply to Harvard for EA and also apply to like schools like the University of Michigan, Purdue, UIUC, for instance. Those are all options that you can do. Okay. So if it's an EA, like a pure EA, you can theoretically apply to as many EAs as you want along with your ED school. So let's say hypothetically, if I'm interested in business or engineering, I could apply to, let's say, Cornell, and then have even as many as 3, 4, 5, or even 6 EA schools. You can apply to like Michigan, Purdue, UIUC, University of North Carolina, University of Virginia, I mean, you name it, right? So there are a lot of, especially public institutions that don't have single choice or restricted early actions. So you can actually have a whole bunch of schools that are not necessarily these days safety schools, but they would actually be good target schools. And then maybe one of them could be an early safety. Okay. So it really all depends on how much work you think you can get done between, I guess, when the applications are out August 1st and when your earlies are due, which are typically going to be around November 1st. Okay. Okay, so in terms of overall number of applications, it really all depends on what you're looking for, right? So if you're applying to too many schools, the problem here too is that it could dilute the quality of your efforts because then, if you're trying to apply to, let's say, well, I mean, the common application has a cap of 20 schools, right? But some people can apply to the UC application, Cal State's. They might even use like system applications that some schools have that's outside of the common app. So in theory, you can even apply to like 25 or 30 schools. But then the question is that really a good idea, right? Because the more schools you apply to, that means more work for essays, the more stressful it gets. And oftentimes what happens is toward the end of the process, some students get so rushed that they can't even write quality essays anymore. They end up recycling essays, and this is where mistakes sometimes happen, where, you forget that you put, let's say, Columbia when you're using that essay for Washington University in St. Louis, right? So problems like that could arise. It's not a good idea. So obviously, if you are planning to be aggressive in applying to a lot of schools, you want to make sure that you are, planning that out. You're definitely starting the process much earlier. Obviously, this is why, services like HS2, our counselors, have a lot of years of experience helping manage this whole process with students, so it's less stressful for them because they can actually go ahead and do it in a way that's a lot more regimented and planned. Okay. Some schools may also require things like visits or interviews, which could be harder for you to fit in your schedule if you're applying to too many schools. And then definitely last but not least, you also don't want to overload your high school guidance counselor, because if they feel like you're just unnecessarily applying to too many schools, they might just really get stressed out and annoyed by that, right? And that could potentially impact the quality of the recommendation letter that you're getting from that said high school guidance counselor. Okay, so a nice balance. Typically, we tell students have a college list of maybe something around 10 to 15 schools, including your EA or ED schools. Okay. Now, only maybe consider adding more to that if you've finished those 10 to 15 in a timely fashion. Let's say you're done with those schools by, let's say, December 1st, and you want to try for 2 or 3 more schools. Maybe, right? It's possible for you to go ahead and try that as long as you've talked to your counselor ahead of time and make sure that you can finish the work that's involved with those remaining schools. Okay, so one other key thing that you can do to help your chances for EA and ED schools is to demonstrate your interest in these colleges, right? So there are a couple of key ways that it can help you out. So oftentimes you might hear in admissions this phrase demonstrated interest. Usually this matters more for schools that are less selective, like maybe things like your safety schools, where they legitimately track like if you responded to emails, whether or not you attended their info seminars at your school, right? Because they're really trying to track and predict which students are more likely to say yes to them. However, this doesn't always necessarily apply to the most selective schools. Now, just because a school doesn't officially track your demonstrated interest doesn't mean that you should refrain from showing interest in those schools, especially if it's something that you're considering as an ED school, because many of these schools do want to see that you really have a strong interest in attending their school, right? And there are a couple of ways that can also help you. So visiting the campus or participating in programs at their college can make you sound more informed about the schools, right? You can also show a little bit more enthusiasm in things like the interview process, or especially if you're writing about these schools in your college essays. Unsurprisingly, many ED schools will probably have at least one of their supplemental essays talking about, oh, why are you interested in studying this particular major at our college or university? Okay. And so if you didn't really do the research, then it doesn't really sound like you know much about their school, right? So many of these schools want to decide if you're a good fit, right? Do you know how their college and their programs will, coincide or match your interests and what you bring to their university, right? So if you're genuinely set on applying to a school for ED, it makes sense for you to go ahead and try to show your interest in the school in multiple ways. Like I said, by visiting the campus, by participating in like maybe summer programs if the school has it at their university. Okay. Now, as far as summer programs go, though, be very careful. Just because you attended a school's summer program does not automatically give you an advantage to that school simply by virtue of affiliation. In other words, if I went to a UPenn summer program, it doesn't automatically mean that I get a better shot at getting into UPenn. However, doing a program there could be helpful because like if that program is very selective, it could signal to the colleges that you actually were already self-selected or filtered through a more competitive summer program. It could also help out with, like I said, things like the essay, where you can show a little bit more institutional knowledge and fit. Okay. It's also strategically advantageous for you to consider, establishing contact with people at that university. This could be the case for, like, say, professors, right? So if you're thinking of applying for a certain major and you email and reach out to certain professors on that university, they may even be able to do things like put in a good word for you with the admissions office. Same holds true if you're applying to the school for a very competitive activity. Like if you're really good in music, if you're very good for activities like speech and debate, or if you play a sport and you're considering doing that at that university, I would highly advise that you establish contact with the coach or coaches for that particular activity, because they could also help inform the school's admissions office of your interest and whether or not you might be a strong, I guess, incoming member to their program, right? So these are all definitely things that you want to take advantage of. And last but not least, you heard me mention that many early action or early decision programs have their deadline around November 1st. Some might be slightly later, like November 15th. But we always advise students to go ahead and send their applications in, ideally a full month before those deadlines, but at the very least about 2 weeks before the deadline. And the reasoning for this is that many times, if you apply early, you're increasing your chances of getting paired with an interviewer, right? So an interview, it's not like a job interview where they offer interviews based on your likelihood of getting the job, right? So this is a common misconception or a myth in the admissions world, right? So just because you're offered an interview doesn't mean they necessarily want you more than another candidate. Oftentimes, it's really just a logistics issue. It's first come, first served. So if you apply early, there's a better chance that they can start forwarding your application to their regional or local admissions or interview chair, right? And that person can then forward it to whoever's available among their alumni interviewers, right? So the sooner you get the application in there in a reasonable fashion, the better your chances of getting interviews, which could in turn help your chances of getting in. And that's not even saying like, the signal that you're sending to colleges, because I mean, what's that going to look like if you're applying to a certain school and they see that you submitted your application at 11:58 p.m. on the day of the deadline, right? It's not going to look good, right? No, it's important for you to know that yes, they do see a timestamp for when you submitted the application, right? So they can very clearly tell when you submitted the application. So oftentimes, if you're seriously interested in the school for ED, it makes a lot of sense for you to go ahead and send an application in a very timely fashion to show that, hey, I got my act together, I'm very organized, and I'm doing my best to make sure that everything is in there for you to consider. Okay. All right. So